All right. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for your time this morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. And Steve, I appreciate your leadership. Steve is, as you all know, brilliant and dynamic leader in thinking about foreign policy. We can accomplish far more in the so-called war on terror by building up than by tearing down. We're way off course, and our current policies are increasing global terrorism instead, bringing more recruits and violence to the cause of terrorism. We should build up in places like Morocco, Afghanistan, Indonesia, Turkey, countries that are already on the tenuous path to political and economic democracy, because positive accomplishments in one Muslim nation will have good effect in all other Muslim nations. This will be especially true if accompanied by a resolution of the terrible dispute between Israel and Palestine, whatever that resolution is, because that dispute is at the heart of global terrorism. I have historically voted as a conservative, as Steve mentioned, but there is nothing intrinsically conservative or Republican about the war in Iraq, or any war. Republicans were elected to end the Korean War. Republicans were elected to end the Vietnam War. Since the invasion of Iraq, the price of oil has gone from $28 a barrel to over $80 a barrel. I think it touched $90 a barrel yesterday. And short-term interest rates have gone up by 400 basis points. Our deficit has gone from essentially non-existent to record highs, all influenced, if even partially, by this war and its trillion-dollar cost. The sustained drain of war, by the way, has also left us more vulnerable to the inevitable other financial stresses, such as the current mortgage calamity. Now, some may think that terrorism is a primarily Islamic phenomenon, but terrorism and terrorists have existed essentially in all historical eras, all countries, and all religions. In fact, in the period since World War II, there have been more occurrences of terrorism in stable democracies than in any other type of country, including the acts of white supremacists in the United States, the Red Brigade in Germany, the Red Army faction in Japan, and others. But the influence of these terrorists is usually very marginal. So the key question then becomes, why aren't terrorists in these Muslim countries equally marginal? What is it in these Middle Eastern countries that causes the broader population to respond supportively to terrorism? Wherever you look in history, now or in the past, the answer is the same. Terrorists gain support where there is occupation or oppression. By occupation, by the way, we mean like that of Ireland by England that led to the IRA. By oppression, we mean like the dictatorship in Peru that led to the Shining Path. Throughout time and across the globe, people are not predisposed to follow the lead of terrorists. They instead want what people everywhere have always wanted: meaning and purpose in their lives, sustenance and economic opportunity, family, friends, happiness. They want to matter. They want to have respect. For a population to succumb to the overtures of terrorists, circumstances must be extreme, which is the terrible case under both occupation and oppression. The common ground between oppression and occupation is that people are deprived of participation in government, and the basic obligations of a government to its people are not met, especially in the enforcement of property rights, safety, and access to opportunity. When this happens, the results are poverty and despair, the very things that make a population vulnerable to the overtures of terrorists and the alternatives they present. Terrorists are known for their acts, which of course are horrifying and murderous. But these acts are almost always the only military means the weak and out of power can afford to fight their oppressors, and thus they recur throughout history. Terrorist groups can be characterized by something else, too. They gain relevance by fulfilling those basic obligations of government, such as hospitals and schools, that are unmet. People respond to those that provide for what they need. It follows, then, that terrorism exists among Muslims because so many Muslim countries have long been subject to occupation and oppression. Of the 6.7 billion people in the world today, roughly 1.3 billion are Muslim. 45 of the world's 193 countries are predominantly Muslim. Of these 45, 41 are former colonies or subsumed Soviet states, harshly excluded from economic opportunity, gutted of leadership, and subjected to servitude, imprisonment, and worse. Becoming colonies hobble the development of political and economic leadership within these countries, so much so that we shouldn't be surprised at the current state of leadership and institutions in these countries and their resulting propensity towards dictatorships. In fact, of these 45 countries, 37, by our imperfect count, are still not democracies, and Western nations still back some number of these dictators. Given the 1.3 billion person size of this population, if even the tiniest fraction are terrorists, the effect is large. In contrast, it was almost impossible for the impact of IRA terrorists to be felt much beyond the shores of Northern Ireland, since the population of Northern Ireland was less than 1 million. Allow me to make a crucial additional observation. Because Islamic fundamentalism is so intertwined in the minds, in the press, in actuality with Muslim terrorism, it is critical to comment for a moment on fundamentalism. Fundamentalism, whether in Islam or Judaism or Christianity, is a reaction to great stress or rapid change within a society or country. Where you have great stress or change, where you have rapid economic, social, or moral dislocation, where the moorings of life have come loose, fundamentalism has flourished. Where you have war, pogroms, or oppression, where there is fear about the future, fundamentalism has flourished. Fundamentalism is grasping for certainty in a world of great uncertainty and change. So this religious fundamentalism, rather than being a cause of terrorism, is something grasped by the oppressed to cope with their oppression. The presence of fundamentalism in large numbers in certain countries, rather than simply being a sign of a backslide, is instead evidence of how much stress they are enduring or how fast they are being pulled forward. So, the best way to reduce terrorism is by addressing situations of oppression and occupation. We clearly need to track terrorists in order to prevent future attacks and to find those that have attacked us in the past so they can do no more harm. We need to do this. Still, to get to the underlying causes of terrorism and to prevent the ranks of future terrorists from increasing, we must focus on occupation and oppression. Importantly, a terrorist group's efforts to overcome its oppressor rarely leads to an enduring solution. In fact, most often when terrorists overcome an oppressor or occupier, the result is more of the same. Witness the Bolsheviks' overthrow of the Tsar. Occupation and oppression can only be overcome by democracy, by ceding power to the governed, to the broad population, and by separating and limiting the powers of government. This was the strong contention of the Bush administration, and they were correct. But crucially, democracy cannot take root The distribution or decentralization of power cannot move forward unless it is accompanied by an equally vigorous distribution of wealth and economic opportunity among that same broad population. Power cannot be held by the broad population unless that broad population can afford to hold that power. The Bush administration failed to grasp the essential role of broadened economic opportunity in building democracy, and its lack of spending in this area reflects this. And in Iraq, the Bush administration failed by making its most visible attempt at building a democracy in a place where a civil war was about to break out. Some have observed, by the way, that elections in Palestine and elsewhere, democracy, have led to greater extremism and thus should be deferred or avoided. Our answer is, of course they have. Because the economic conditions there, not to mention the realities of governments, are as dire as anywhere in the world. People vote against governments under which they are suffering. That's why the economic dimension is mandatory. Here's an example where the introduction of economic and political democracy quelled the terrorists. In Peru in the 1980s and 90s, the Shining Path was a murderous terrorist group violently opposed to Peru's corrupt and autocratic government. The majority of Peruvians were in fact very poor and were thus open to the communist message of their oppressors. Today, the Shining Path essentially no longer exists. One of the largest reasons was the property rights reform championed by, among others, Hernando de Soto, comparable to what was done through homestead acts in America during the 1800s and the land distribution in Japan after World War II, which were keys to creating the large middle class that is now found in both countries. Peru's land reform occurred in conjunction with Peru's movement to democracy, and land reform both benefited from democracy and helped ensure that democracy's success. Together they made the Shining Path infinitely less relevant. Thus, the most central question in terrorism isn't how to stop terrorists, it is instead how to prevent future terrorists, which is how to broadly distribute both power and economic opportunity in countries where oppression and occupation now prevail. This formula will also work in Iraq, but only after the enormous challenge of dealing with Iraq's civil war. And we believe that the soft partition plan, such as was used in Bosnia-Herzegovina, is the best method for achieving the stability that is a prerequisite for economic recovery. And it's important to note, while we're talking about ethnic and religious civil war, that countries fracturing into religious and ethnic factions because of duress is one of the dominant facts of the last century. And we know that reversing any such fracture is an extremely difficult thing and cannot reasonably proceed without a foundation of economic plenty and representative government. We can accomplish far more in the so-called war on terror by building up rather than tearing down. We would invoke, as so many have in other circumstances, the Marshall Plan. Our policies towards reducing terrorism and effecting economic and political democratization in Muslim countries should reflect the spirit and character of George Marshall. This initiative should incorporate our relationship with all 45 predominantly Muslim countries, not just one or a few, from Morocco to Syria to Dubai to Azerbaijan to Somalia and Indonesia and more. Our relationship with each of these countries added together shapes the global Muslim community's view and posture towards the U.S. Successful relationships with Turkey and Morocco, for example, positively affect the perception of America in Syria. Negative relations with Palestinians adversely affects our relationships with Muslims in all other countries and, equally importantly, in the Muslim diaspora. We have veered dangerously off course, but what is powerful here is that our instinct to reach out and help and our instinct to subdue terrorism, which are often thought of as two separate issues, can be met together as one. And it's in our own self-interest to act. If we take the $1 trillion or $2 trillion that's being spent on the Iraq War, or any small fraction thereof, and spend it on building up rather than tearing down, then, and only then, will global terrorism decrease. Thanks.
Thank you, Richard.